She never made it to the door. Charlotte Dalton stood frozen in the middle of Harvey Collier's front yard, her horse still heaving behind her, dust settling around her boots like a slow surrender. She had ridden 6 miles through the scorching August heat of 1878 with a single purpose burning behind her eyes, a warning folded tight in her chest, the kind of warning that could save a man's life or end everything she had ever known about herself. And now she was standing 20 feet from his porch steps, watching him lean against the post with his arms crossed and his dark eyes fixed on her, and she could not make her feet move forward. The warning had been her father's idea. Or rather, her father's threat dressed up as concern. "Go tell Harvey Collier to sell that water contract before the week ends," Silas Dalton had said that morning, his voice the low, grinding kind that never needed to rise to make a person feel small. "Tell him if he doesn't, he'll regret it. You say it exactly like that." Charlotte had saddled her horse. She had ridden all 6 miles with the words rehearsed in her mouth. She had turned onto Collier land and watched his fence posts blur past her and told herself this was simple. This was just a delivery. This was just words. This meant nothing about who she was or what she believed or the secret she had been keeping buried in her chest for 2 years running. And then she had seen him standing on that porch, and the words had dissolved like salt in hot water. Harvey Collier had not moved. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something caught between suspicion and something more complicated. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of hauling fence wire and wrestling cattle from dried creek beds, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar from the heat. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. He had the look of a man who had been expecting trouble and was mildly surprised at what trouble had sent. "Charlotte," he said finally, his voice carrying easy across the yard. "You going to stand out there all afternoon, or are you going to tell me what you came to say?" She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, and then she turned around, put her boot in the stirrup, and swung herself back onto her horse. That was when he came off the porch. "Hey," his voice was different now. Not hard, not commanding, just surprised, genuinely, purely surprised in a way that stopped her hand on the reins. "Charlotte, wait." She waited. She did not know why. She had been not knowing why where Harvey Collier was concerned for going on 2 years now, and it had never once made her life easier. He reached her horse's head, laid a hand on the bridle, not rough, not forcing, just present. He looked up at her, squinting slightly against the afternoon sun, and asked the question that broke everything open. "Why didn't you deliver it?" The summer of 1876 had been the last good summer anyone in the Painted Rock Valley could clearly remember. The rains had come on schedule that year. The grass had grown deep and sweet along the creek banks, and the 2 largest cattle operations in the valley, Silas Dalton's Double D Ranch and Harvey Collier's newly inherited spread, had coexisted with the particular brittle courtesy of neighbors who understood that the land between them was more valuable than any quarrel. Harvey Collier had come into the valley at 26, inheriting his uncle's ranch after old Marcus Collier had died of a fever that spring. Harvey had grown up in Kansas, had worked cattle drives up the Kishom Trail 3 seasons running, and had arrived in Painted Rock Valley with calloused hands, an honest reputation, and approximately $40 in his pocket beyond what it cost to keep his men paid through the autumn. He was not rich. He was not powerful. What he had was land, and the instinct to work it well, and the kind of quiet, undemonstrative character that earned him the trust of his ranch hands within the first 2 weeks of his arrival. Silas Dalton had been watching him since the day he rode in. Silas Dalton was everything Harvey Collier was not, in the ways that matter most to men who define themselves by what they possess. He was 53 years old, thick through the middle, silver-haired, with the particular brand of local power that comes from having been in a place long enough that people forget there was ever a time before you. He owned the Double D, 4,000 acres of prime valley grassland. He owned a significant interest in the Painted Rock Bank. He had over 20 years of careful, patient, occasionally ruthless maneuvering, positioned himself as the kind of man whose opinion settled disputes before they became fights, and whose displeasure had a way of becoming expensive for whomever it landed on. What he did not own was the water contract. The water contract was the document that controlled the diversion rights to Crow Creek, the only reliable year-round water source in the valley. Marcus Collier had held it for 40 years. When Marcus died, it passed with the land to Harvey Collier, which meant that a 26-year-old newcomer from Kansas suddenly held something that Silas Dalton had been trying to acquire for the better part of a decade. This was, by any reasonable measure, an intolerable situation in Silas Dalton's estimation. Charlotte Dalton had grown up in the shadow of her father's ambitions and her father's rages, the only daughter in a household that had never quite figured out what to do with her. She had two older brothers, Frank and Cal, who rode and drank and deferred to Silas in all things, who were being groomed to inherit the Double D and carry forward the Dalton name with appropriately aggressive intentions. Charlotte had been educated better than most women in the valley by a series of itinerant teachers her mother had hired before Elizabeth Dalton's death in 1874, and she had a mind that her father acknowledged sometimes with pride and more often with impatience, because it had a persistent habit of arriving at conclusions that disagreed with his. She had met Harvey Collier for the first time at the Painted Rock 4th of July celebration in 1876. She had been 20, newly returned from a 6-month stay in Denver with her mother's sister, where she had done enough reading and enough observing of a wider world to come back to the valley feeling slightly foreign in her own life. The celebration had been held in the main square, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and the smell of roasted corn in the air, and her father's voice had been the loudest in every group she passed through, which was as it always was. Harvey Collier had been standing near the edge of things, holding a glass of lemonade and watching the crowd with the attentive, slightly detached expression of someone new enough to still be cataloging rather than participating. He was not trying to be noticed. That was, she would realize later, one of the first things that set him apart in a landscape populated by men who spent considerable energy on being noticed. Their conversation that day had been brief and entirely ordinary. She had asked him how he was finding the valley. He had said it was greener than Kansas. She had asked if that was good. He had said he thought so, yes. They had both smiled in the slightly cautious way of two people who sense that ordinary conversation may be, for them, something more complicated. Her father had found her elbow 17 minutes into the interaction, steered her gently but unmistakably away, and had said that evening at dinner that Harvey Collier was a man to be watched, not a man to be friendly with. Charlotte had said nothing. She had thought about that smile for the next 3 days. The summer of 1876 passed and the autumn came cold and hard, and then the winter of 1877 brought drought conditions that settled over Painted Rock Valley like a judgment. The creek ran lower, the grass thinned, the cattle lost weight. And Silas Dalton, who had weathered dry spells before through a combination of reserves and ruthlessness, turned his full and concentrated attention to the water contract that sat in Harvey Collier's land files like a splinter in his palm. He had sent a lawyer first. Harvey's response had been polite and final. The water contract was not for sale. He had sent Frank Dalton next, with a number attached to an offer that Silas considered generous. Harvey had said thank you and meant no. He had tried leveraging the bank, where he held enough influence to make a young rancher's credit uncomfortable. Harvey had ridden to the county seat, arranged his financing elsewhere, and returned without comment. Each refusal had made Silas Dalton quieter and more dangerous in the way that cornered things become dangerous, not loudly but with increasing concentration. Charlotte had been watching all of this from the inside of her father's house, and she had also, in the limited ways available to a young woman in a small valley in 1877, been watching Harvey Collier from the outside of it. She had seen him at the general store, at Sunday services, at the cattle auction in April. Their conversations had progressed from brief to something longer, from polite to something warmer, always careful, always aware of what they were navigating around, but building something quietly in the spaces between the careful words. He had asked her once, standing outside the mercantile while their horses waited at the rail, whether she liked living in the valley. She had considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and given him a version of it. "I like the land," she had said. "I have some difficulty with the arrangements of the people on it." He had looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense that he understood exactly what she meant. "That's a careful way to say something true," he had said. "I'm good at careful," she had said. "I know," he had said. "I've noticed." That was the moment, she thought later if she was looking for a moment. That was the one where the thing between them stopped being incidental and became deliberate, became something she chose rather than stumbled into. The problem was that choosing Harvey Collier was, in her father's world, something very close to treason. By the spring of 1878, the drought had deepened. The creek was running at less than half its normal capacity, and the question of who controlled the diversion rights had gone from being a matter of business advantage to being a matter of survival for every operation in the valley. Sila's Dalton held the largest herd. If the water was allocated according to the existing contract, the Double D would receive its fair share, which was significant but not dominant. If Sila's controlled the contract himself, he could ensure his cattle drank first, deepest, and longest. He had begun to say things at dinner, things about Harvey Collier specifically, about men who came from nowhere and thought they could hold what they did not earn, about how the valley had ways of correcting such situations over time. Frank and Cal had listened with the particular attentiveness of sons who understood they were receiving instructions. Charlotte had eaten her food and watched her father's hands and felt the warning building in the air like weather. In June of 1878, something had happened that she had not been supposed to see. She had come into her father's study to return a book she had borrowed from his shelf, a habit she had maintained since childhood without particular comment, and she had heard voices through the partially open door before she reached it. Her father's voice, and another voice lower, one she had to think about before placing. Wade Humphreys, a hired man who had worked the valley for various outfits and who had a reputation that respectable people discussed in lowered tones when they discussed him at all. She had stopped in the hallway and she had listened. She was not proud of it. She also did not regret it. What she heard was 30 seconds of conversation, but 30 seconds was enough. Her father was telling Wade Humphreys that Harvey Collier needed to be convinced to leave the valley. Not harmed, Silas had said, with a precision that Charlotte recognized as the precision of a man being careful about how history would record his instructions. Not harmed, but made uncomfortable enough, inconvenienced in ways significant enough, that selling and moving on would begin to seem like the reasonable choice. Wade Humphreys had said he understood. Charlotte had gone back to her room with the book still in her hands, and had sat on the edge of her bed, and thought about what she had heard until the dinner bell rang, and then she had gone down and eaten her meal and said nothing. She had told herself she was waiting for more information. She had told herself it might come to nothing. She had told herself that getting between her father's intentions and their target was a thing that required more courage than she presently had, and that she would be braver soon when she knew more, when the moment was clearer. This was, she knew even as she thought it, the kind of lie that people tell themselves while they are being cowards about something. In late July, her father had summoned her. He had been sitting behind his desk, calm and deliberate, with a piece of paper in his hand. He had explained to her, with the careful patience of someone speaking to a person who needed to be managed, that Harvey Collier was going to sell the water contract because he was going to realize over the next several weeks that the valley was not a welcoming place for him. This was simply the natural resolution of a business disagreement. No one was being harmed. It was just pressure. Charlotte had asked if Harvey knew how much pressure was being considered. Her father had smiled. "That's why I need you," he had said. "Go to his ranch. Tell him to sell before the week ends. Tell him if he doesn't, he'll regret it. He'll hear it different coming from you than from Frank or Cal. He'll believe it's kindness. She had understood then, in the full and nauseating clarity of it, what her father was asking, not just for a message delivered, for her credibility as collateral, for the warmth in her voice that Harvey Collier might recognize and trust. Her father had noticed things about her and Harvey Collier, and rather than forbidding it, he was now proposing to use it. She had saddled her horse and ridden the 6 miles in the morning heat and rehearsed the words all the way, and she had arrived at Harvey Collier's ranch with the warning balanced on the tip of her tongue like a coin on a blade's edge. And then she had seen him on the porch, and the coin had fallen. Now she sat on her horse with his hand on the bridle and his question hanging in the air between them, and she thought about all the careful things she had said in 2 years of careful things, and she thought about her father's smile, and she thought about Wade Humphrey's voice through a half-open door, and she made a decision that she understood would change the shape of every day she lived from this moment forward. "Get your horse," she said. "I need to show you something, and I can't say it standing in your yard." He did not ask why. He went to the barn, and she waited, and 7 minutes later he came back on a gray roan that she had seen him ride a dozen times before, and they went together without ceremony in the direction of the creek, where the cottonwoods were thick enough to break the sight lines to both ranches. They rode in silence for a quarter mile. The creek was running low, just a thread of brown-green water in the bottom of a channel that was usually twice as full, and the cottonwood leaves were dry at the edges from the heat. Charlotte dismounted at a flat rock where the bank widened out, and Harvey pulled up beside her and stepped down and tied his horse to a low branch and waited. She looked at the water for a moment. Then she told him everything. She started with the day in the hallway, the 30 seconds that she had replayed in her mind every day since June. She told him about Wade Humphreys and the word convince, and the precision of not harmed, spoken by a man who understood that the line between pressure and harm was something he needed plausible distance from. She told him about the ways her father had tested the valley's social pressure against him already, the lawyer, the offers, the bank maneuvers, and she told him that what was coming now was something different, something more physical and deliberate. Harvey listened without interrupting. She had expected him to look angry because the situation warranted anger, but what he looked was something more complicated. He looked like a man absorbing information that was both new and not entirely surprising, sorting it against things he had already half understood. When she finished, she looked at him directly for the first time since they had stopped, and what she saw in his face made her throat tight. "You came to deliver his warning," he said quietly. "Yes. And you didn't." "No." "Why?" This was the question she had known he would ask, the one she had ridden toward and away from simultaneously for 6 miles. She took a breath and looked at the thin line of creek water and thought about every careful word she had ever said in her life, and felt suddenly exhausted by all of them. "Because I've been watching you for 2 years, she said. "And you're the most honest man I've met in this valley, and you don't deserve what's being planned for you. And I couldn't make myself be the instrument of it, even if it means going home and facing my father's anger, which it will. And I am scared of that, but I am more scared of what I'd think of myself if I delivered that message and let the rest happen." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a very brave thing to say," he said. "It doesn't feel brave," she said. "It feels terrifying." "Those are generally the same thing," he said. She almost smiled. She stopped herself. "You need to take this seriously," she said. "Wade Humphreys is not a man to dismiss. He has done things in other counties that people talk about carefully. My father is not asking him to kill you, but there is a significant amount of space between alive and comfortable, and Humphreys is familiar with all of it." Harvey nodded slowly. He moved to the creek bank and crouched down, picked up a flat stone, turned it over in his fingers. He had the settled quality of a man whose thinking happened in his hands as much as his head. "How long do I have?" he asked. "My father said the week. I imagine Humphreys has already been given his instructions. I don't know what form they'll take." "Cattle, probably," Harvey said. "Or water infrastructure, something that looks like it could be accident or bad luck." "Yes," Charlotte said. "That's what I think too." He stood and turned to face her, and there was something in his expression now that she could not look away from, a directness that felt different from the careful social distances they had maintained for 2 years. "Charlotte," he said, "you know what you've done by telling me this." "I know," she said. "You can't go home and pretend you delivered the message. He'll know soon enough that nothing's changed. He'll figure out you warned me." "I know," she said again. "And then what happens to you?" She had thought about this on the ride over. She had thought about it with the particular clarity that comes from making a decision that cannot be unmade, from crossing a line that does not have a crossing back. "I don't know," she said honestly. "My father's anger is something I've been navigating my whole life. I've gotten good at the edges of it. The center of it is another thing." Harvey was looking at her steadily. "You could stay," he said. The word landed in the afternoon heat with a weight that surprised her. "Stay," she repeated. "Not here," he said quickly, with the faint coloring of a man who had said something that came out slightly sideways from what he intended. "Not like that. I mean in the valley. Don't go back tonight. Go to Mrs. Greer's boarding house in town. Get a room. Give yourself some distance from the Double D before this plays out." She considered this. "My brothers will look for me," she said. "Let them look," he said. "You're 22 years old and you've done nothing wrong. You just chose not to deliver a message on behalf of a man who was using you to threaten his neighbor. That is not a crime. That's a conscience." She looked at him for a long moment. "You make it sound simple," she said. "I know it isn't," he said. "But the complicated part doesn't start until you decide which side of it you're going to stand on." She had been thinking about which side of things she was going to stand on for 2 years. She had been thinking about it in the hallway with the book in her hands, at the dinner table with her father's voice, filling all the available air, in the quiet of her own room at night when the choices available to her seemed simultaneously too small and too large to hold. She looked at the creek running low and thin. "All right," she said. They rode toward Painted Rock together in the late afternoon light, not touching, not talking much, but with the particular charged quality of two people who have just agreed to something that will cost them both before it's finished. The town of Painted Rock in 1878 was a main street half a mile long, anchored by a bank, a general store, a livery, 2 saloons, a barber shop, a feed store, and Mrs. Greer's boarding house, which occupied a 2-story frame building at the quieter eastern end of town, and was the province of the respectable and the temporarily displaced. Margaret Greer herself was a widow of 60 who had the particular unimpressibility of a woman who had seen enough of human nature to be neither surprised nor especially moved by most of it. She was also, Charlotte knew, the one person in Painted Rock who could be relied upon for discretion, not from naivety but from a deliberate policy of minding her own business except when asked. Charlotte got a room. Harvey paid for 3 nights without making a thing of it, just laid the money on the counter and told Mrs. Greer to send any bill to the Collier ranch. And Mrs. Greer had accepted this with the particular neutrality of a woman who asked no questions. She did not need the answers to. In the hallway outside her room, Harvey had paused. "I'm going to the sheriff," he said. "Jim Waverly has known my uncle for 20 years. He's a fair man. I need to tell him what's coming before it arrives." "He won't act on what I told you," Charlotte said. "Not without evidence. A conversation heard through a half-open door in someone else's house won't be enough." "I know," Harvey said, "but I want him forewarned. And I want someone in an official position to know that if something happens to my property in the next week, there's a direction to look in." This was, Charlotte thought, exactly the kind of steady, pragmatic thinking that had made her trust him in the first place. "Be careful," she said, and then felt strange about having said it, too familiar, too forward for a woman who had managed 2 years of careful distances. Harvey looked at her with that direct quality that she could never quite armor herself against. "You be careful too," he said. "Your father is going to come looking. And he's going to be angry in the way that men are angry when they realize they overestimated their hold on someone." She nodded. He went. She stood in the hallway of Mrs. Greer's boarding house and listened to his boots on the stairs, and thought that she had just set fire to her old life and was standing in the smoke waiting to see what was left. The night passed slowly. She slept in pieces, waking to the sounds of the town settling, the distant noise of one of the saloons, a horse on the street below. She thought about her father's face when he realized what she had done. She thought about her brothers, Frank's hot temper and Cal's cold practicality, and the ways each of them would respond. She thought about everything that had been true about her life for 22 years, and how much of it she had accepted as fixed and inevitable when it was neither of those things. She thought about Harvey Collier's voice saying, "You just chose not to deliver a message," as though the thing she had done was not enormous but ordinary, as though people chose which messages they would carry all the time, and it was simply a matter of conscience rather than an act of complete reconstruction of everything she had understood about who she was in her father's world. Morning came hard and bright. She was eating breakfast in Mrs. Greer's small dining room when the door opened, and Frank Dalton came through it with the look of a man who had ridden fast and was holding his temper at the front of his teeth. Charlotte set down her fork. Frank was 30 years old, lean and sundark, with their father's eyes and a mouth that had always had trouble with patience. He looked at her across the small room, and she could see him doing the calculation, measuring the territory, deciding how much of his authority would hold here in a public room in front of Mrs. Greer and 2 other boarders. Not enough, his eyes concluded. Not here. "Charlotte," he said, "Father wants you home." "I know he does," she said. "Come on, then." "No," she said. The word sat between them like a stone in a still pool, and she watched the ripples move across Frank's face. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice dropping to something that was not quite quiet. "I understand it completely," she said. "Charlotte." He moved toward her and she stayed still, and he stopped at the table edge looking down at her, and she could see the conflict in him, could see the boy she had grown up with and the man their father had made him into, and the fact that those 2 things were not always in agreement. "Frank," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm not coming home today. I need some time to think, and I need some distance. You can tell Father that, and you can tell him I'm safe and I'm in town and no harm has come to anyone. That's all that needs saying for now." Frank looked at her for a long moment. "He's going to send Cal," he said. "Cal won't be as easy as me." "I know," she said. He turned and went, and the dining room returned to its ordinary breakfast sounds, and Charlotte picked up her fork and found that her hands were not entirely steady. Harvey Collier arrived 2 hours later on foot, having left his horse at the livery. He came through the door of Mrs. Greer's with the particular directness of a man who has been moving with purpose and is not interested in delay. "Sheriff Waverly has been told," he said. Sitting down across from her at the table Mrs. Greer had cleared of its breakfast things. "He's as I expected, careful but listening. He told me if anything happens on my property to send for him immediately." "That's something," Charlotte said. "More than nothing," Harvey agreed. "I also talked to Ben Reedy." Ben Reedy was the editor of the Painted Rock Courier, the Valley's weekly paper, a small operation run from a building not much larger than a closet, but with a readership that extended to every corner of the valley and the county seat beyond. Charlotte looked at him. "What did you tell Ben Reedy?" she asked. "I told him there was a story worth watching," Harvey said. "About water rights and the pressure that can come to bear on a man who holds them when someone else wants them badly enough. I didn't give him names yet, but I want him aware and I want him watching." "My father will go after Reedy if the paper runs something about him," Charlotte said. "Your father going after Reedy publicly will itself be a story," Harvey said. "That's rather the point." She looked at him. "You are more strategic than you look," she said. Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that was careful but real. "I've been minding this situation since last spring," he said. "I knew the pressure was building. I just didn't know what form it would take. Now I do." He paused. "Because of you." She looked down at the table. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "When I heard it through the door in June, I spent 2 months being a coward about it." "You spent 2 months in a difficult situation," he said. Being cautious about a thing that could have enormous consequences for you is not the same as being a coward. You're being generous, she said. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I understand what it costs to go against the person who holds the most power over your daily life. She looked up. He was watching her with that direct, steady quality that she had never entirely known what to do with. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we wait and see which form Humphrey's attention takes, and we deal with it in the light instead of the dark. And while we're waiting," he said, more quietly, "I'd like to stop pretending that our conversations at the Mercantile and after Sunday services are as ordinary as I've been making them out to be." The words landed in the space between them with a weight and a warmth that was entirely different from anything that had come before. She looked at him. "That's a very direct thing to say," she said. "I've been indirect for 2 years," he said. "It hasn't solved anything." She was quiet for a moment, thinking of all the careful conversations, all the managed distances, all the things she had felt and not said in the language of caution. "No," she said, "it hasn't." "I like you very much, Charlotte," he said, with the plain and unhurried honesty of a man who did not deal in ornamentation. "I have since the 4th of July in '76. I've been careful about it because your father was already a complication before he became an active threat, and because I didn't want to make your situation harder than it already was. But you rode 6 miles in August heat to warn me about something that was going to cost you considerably, and I think honesty is the least I owe you in return." She breathed carefully. "I like you very much too," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, but it was honest. "Good," he said. "This is an extremely inconvenient time to be saying these things," she said. "Probably the best time," he said. "Things are already complicated. Might as well be honest in the middle of it." She almost laughed. She caught it but not quite, and the smile came through, and she saw him notice it and the warmth in his eyes deepen. "We should still be careful," she said. "We should," he agreed. "But not about the wrong things." The incident came on the 3rd day. Harvey had ridden back to his ranch that afternoon, leaving his foreman, a laconic, reliable man named Abe Torres, in charge of the day-to-day, while Harvey moved between the ranch and town with more frequency than usual. Charlotte had stayed at Mrs. Greer's, quietly, watching the town go about its business from the front porch with a book in her lap, speaking to people who passed, keeping herself visible and untroubled in public, while the tension she could not name moved through the air like heat off summer stone. On the 3rd morning, Abe Torres rode into town at a fast pace and went directly to Harvey, who had been having breakfast at the small cafe 3 doors down from the boarding house. Charlotte saw them through the window and was outside before she had made a conscious decision to be. Harvey looked at her when she came around the corner, and the look told her something had happened. "The diversion gate on the upper creek," Harvey said, his voice controlled. "Somebody wedged it open in the night. The water's running through at the full volume instead of being directed. Half of it's going to ground before it reaches the lower pasture." Charlotte felt the cold, specific anger of recognition. "The cattle?" she asked. "All right for now," Abe Torres said. "We caught it this morning. We can fix the gate today, but it was deliberate. The wedge was ironwood cut to fit. Not accident, not wear. Someone had come in the night with a piece of cut wood and a plan." Harvey was watching Charlotte. "Sheriff," she said. "Already sent for," Abe said. Jim Waverly arrived within the hour, a solid, thoughtful man of 55 who had been sheriff of Painted Rock County for 11 years, and who carried the particular careful authority of a man who understood that the law in a small valley was a web of relationships as much as a set of statutes, and that pulling one thread too hard could unravel things in ways that were difficult to mend. He examined the gate. He examined the wedge. He asked questions of Harvey's men with the methodical patience of someone who already had a sense of the answer and was building his evidence in the right order. He did not arrest anyone that day. There was not enough for that. But he came to Harvey before he left and spoke quietly. "I'm going to have a conversation with Silas Dalton," he said. "I'm not going to accuse, I'm going to inform. I'm going to let him know that I am aware of a situation and that I am watching it with both eyes." "Will it be enough?" Harvey asked. "It will communicate something important," Waverly said, "which is that the light is on." This was, Charlotte thought, exactly the right language. Her father operated in the dark. He always had. Not because he was stupid, but because he was experienced enough to know that the things he wanted required spaces, that the community's conscience did not illuminate too closely. Turning a light on was not nothing, but it was not everything either. Wade Humphreys was not her father. He had been given instructions and had taken money, and a sheriff's conversation with Silas Dalton was not, on its own, the kind of thing that stopped a man like Humphreys unless the instructions were explicitly withdrawn. That afternoon, Charlotte made a decision. She went to the Double D not to stay, not to apologize. She saddled the horse she had left at the town livery, and she rode out to her father's ranch with the same deliberate calm she had been practicing for 3 days. And she arrived at the front of the house she had grown up in and dismounted and went inside as though she owned the right to be there, which she did, because it had been her home for 22 years. Her father was in his study. He looked up when she came in with the particular controlled expression of a man who has been waiting and has chosen the expression he will wear when the thing arrives. "Charlotte," he said. "Father," she said, "you didn't deliver my message." "No," she said, "I didn't, because you warned him." "Yes," she said, "because I warned him." Her father was quiet for a moment. He had the extraordinary capacity for stillness that powerful men sometimes develop, the ability to be very calm in situations where they are very angry because they know they do not need to express the anger to make the person in front of them feel it. Charlotte felt it. She had been feeling it her whole life. She stood straight. "I need you to call off whatever Humphreys has been instructed to do," she said. "Jim Waverly has been to look at the Collier gate. He knows it was deliberate. He is watching, Father, and whatever Humphreys does next will not be in the dark." "You went to the sheriff," her father said. "Harvey went to the sheriff," she said, "because I told him what was coming so he had time to think clearly instead of just reacting." "You've chosen a side," her father said. "I've chosen the right side," she said, and she heard her own voice say it and was surprised by how settled it sounded. "You were asking me to be the instrument of something dishonest and harmful, and I wasn't willing." "He's nobody," her father said, and his voice was quiet and heavy with the contempt that came from 20 years of being the largest thing in a small geography. "He came from nowhere. He's got 40 men and a creek he didn't earn. He'll be gone by autumn one way or the other." "He earned his uncle's trust," Charlotte said, "and his uncle earned that water contract over 40 years. It's his by law and by right, and what you're doing to try to take it isn't." Her father looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen and not wanted to look at. It was not anger exactly. It was the look of a man recalculating something. "Humphreys," she said again, "call him off." "You're not in a position to make demands in my house," her father said. "I'm not demanding," she said. "I'm telling you that Waverly is watching, and the Painted Rock Courier's editor has been made aware that there's a story about water rights worth watching, and whatever happens next is going to be visible in a way that nothing before it has been. That's not a threat. That's information. You've always told me the difference between wisdom and rashness is whether a man acts in full view of consequences." This was, she knew, a calculated thing to say. Her father prided himself on a certain rational pragmatism, on never being caught being impetuous. Offering him a way to retreat that was framed as prudence rather than defeat was the most likely path to him actually retreating. He was quiet for a long moment. "Get out of my house," he said finally. "I'm leaving," she said. "I'll come back when there's a different conversation to have." "Don't count on that conversation happening soon," he said. "I'm not counting on anything," she said. "I'm just telling you what I know." She went back to town. She did not cry, which surprised her a little. She thought she might, somewhere on the road between the Double D and Painted Rock, with the flat and indifferent landscape rolling by on both sides and the weight of what had just been said pressing down on the afternoon. But she did not. She felt instead a clarity that was strange and uncomfortable, and not entirely unpleasant. The clarity of having done the difficult thing and survived it, of having said the true thing in the presence of someone who did not want to hear it and not collapsed under the weight of their displeasure. Harvey was waiting at the boarding house. Mrs. Greer had told him where Charlotte had gone, apparently, and he had arrived 20 minutes before she did, and was sitting in the 2 chairs on the front porch that Mrs. Greer made available to her boarders, looking out at the street with the expression of controlled worry that he was better at hiding than most but not entirely successful with. He stood when she came up the porch steps. "You went to the Double D," he said. "Yes," she said, "alone." "Mrs. Greer knew where I was going," she said, "and I grew up in that house. I was never in physical danger from my father. His weapons are not that kind." Harvey looked at her steadily. "What happened?" he asked. She sat down in one of the chairs. He sat back down in the other. She told him, plainly and in order, and he listened with the full and careful attention that was one of the things she had always found most affecting about him. The way he listened, as though what a person said was something worth actually hearing, rather than just waiting for one's own turn to speak. When she finished, he said quietly, "You told him about Reedy and the courier." "Yes." "That was smart," he said. "Your father is a man who thinks in terms of exposure. Making him conscious of being watched is the most effective pressure available." "I know him," she said. "You do," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Charlotte, what you did today, going to his house and saying that to his face, that took something." "It took nerve," she said. "I had some available today. I may not tomorrow." "The nerve you had today is the kind that builds," he said. "It doesn't go backward." She looked at him. "You say things as though they're simple when they feel enormous," she said. "Sometimes the only difference is the saying of them," he said. In the following days, the valley held its breath. Word moved in painted rock the way it always did in small places, through the specific, careful network of people who knew things and people who needed to know things and the invisible channels between them. People knew that Charlotte Dalton was staying at Greer's boarding house and that Harvey Collier had been seen with her in town on multiple occasions. People knew that Jim Waverly had ridden out to the Collier ranch, and that there had been something of interest at the creek gate. People knew that Ben Reedy was asking questions in the mild but persistent way that journalists ask questions when they have caught the scent of something. What people did not know specifically was what Charlotte had told Harvey, or the full shape of what Silas Dalton had set in motion. What they had were pieces, and they arranged the pieces into various theories with the creative industry of a bored community in the middle of a difficult summer. Wade Humphreys had been seen in town twice. Charlotte had seen him from Mrs. Greer's porch, a lean, sun-weathered man in his early 40s, with a stillness to him that she found more unsettling than bluster. He had not done anything since the Creek Gate incident. Either her conversation with her father had had some effect, or Humphreys was waiting for the light to shift. On a Wednesday evening, 11 days after Charlotte had first ridden onto Harvey's land with an undelivered warning, Harvey came to her at Mrs. Greer's with something in his expression that she had not seen before. He sat across from her in the small parlor Mrs. Greer made available to her boarders, and he placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. "This came today," he said. She opened it. It was an offer, a formal written offer on bank letterhead for the purchase of the water contract. The number was substantial, more than Harvey had been offered before. At the bottom, in the typed formality of legal language, was a line about the offer expiring at the end of the current week. The bank officer named in the letter was a man called Patterson who handled Silas Dalton's accounts. Charlotte read it twice. "He's trying the formal route again," she said. "Yes," Harvey said, "but the number has changed considerably." "Because he needs this resolved," Charlotte said. "The pressure is working the other way now. He knows Waverly is watching and Reedy is watching, and having an active scheme against a neighbor is a liability. Better to try to buy it legitimately." "The offer is significant," Harvey said. He was looking at her carefully. She looked up. "Are you considering it?" she asked. "I'm thinking about it honestly," he said. "Because I think honesty with you requires me to say, the offer is significant and money matters when you're building something from the ground. But I also know that selling this water contract under these circumstances would mean that your father's method worked. It would mean that pressure and threat and a willingness to operate in the shadows are valid business strategies that produce results. And I find I'm not willing to reward that, independently of the money." She looked at him. "There's something else," he said. "What?" she asked. "If I sell and leave," he said quietly, "I lose any reason to stay in the valley, and I find I have a reason to stay now that matters more than any water contract." She looked at him across the small parlor table with the late evening light coming through Mrs. Greer's lace curtains, and the warmth she felt was so large and so complicated that she sat with it for a moment before she could speak. "Don't stay for me," she said. "Stay for the right reasons." "I am staying for the right reasons," he said. "The water contract is one of them, you are another, both of them are right." She breathed carefully. "Harvey," she said. "Charlotte," he said. "I have made a considerable mess of my life in the last 2 weeks," she said. "You have made a considerably more honest version of your life," he said. "Those can look similar from the inside, but they aren't the same thing." She shook her head slowly. "You are unreasonably optimistic," she said. "I'm a rancher in a drought year," he said. "If I weren't optimistic as a baseline, I'd never get out of bed." This time she did laugh, a real one, not caught, not managed, and she saw the pleasure it gave him and thought that she had been careful about so many things for so long that laughter felt like a small rebellion. "What are you going to do about the offer?" she asked. "Write a polite reply declining it," he said, "and send a copy to Jim Waverly and one to Ben Reedy. You're going to copy the sheriff and the newspaper editor on your refusal to sell," she said. "I think transparency in the current climate is valuable," he said, and there was a slight dry quality to his voice that she was learning to recognize. She shook her head again, but she was still smiling. "What do we do about Humphreys?" she asked. "Waverly is watching him," Harvey said. "And I've told my men to document anything unusual, in writing, dated, and witnessed. If Humphreys does anything else, there's a paper record building. Your father is smart enough to understand what a paper record means." The letter went out the following morning. Ben Reedy ran a small notice in that week's Courier, carefully worded, about ongoing negotiations over water rights in the valley and the importance of fair dealing in drought conditions. It did not name Silas Dalton. It did not have to. Charlotte's father read the Courier. Everyone in the valley read the Courier. The following day, Wade Humphreys left Painted Rock. He simply was not there. His horse was gone from the livery where he had been stabling it. His room at the lower boarding house, the one on the western end of town that did not ask many questions, was empty. He was gone without announcement, which was, Charlotte thought, its own kind of announcement. She found out through Mrs. Greer, who found out through the livery owner's wife, which was the particular telegraph of small-town information networks in the American West of 1878. She told Harvey at their morning coffee, which had become a quiet habit over the past 10 days, sitting in Mrs. Greer's parlor with the early light coming through the windows and the day still cool before the August heat settled in. Harvey absorbed the information of Humphrey's departure with the controlled steadiness that was characteristic of him. "Your father pulled him," he said. "Almost certainly," Charlotte said. "Because of the letter copies or the newspaper notice?" "Both," Charlotte said, "and because of what I said to him at the house. He's choosing a different strategy, not retreat, just retrenchment." Meaning he'll wait," she said. "He'll be patient and he'll look for another angle. My father doesn't stop wanting things, he just changes how he goes about getting them." "But for now the active threat is reduced," Harvey said. "For now," she agreed. Harvey set down his coffee cup. "Charlotte," he said. "What are you going to do? Where are you going to live? You can't stay at Greer's indefinitely." This was the question she had been holding at a certain distance, because the answer required decisions she had not fully made and a clarity about her own future that felt new and somewhat vertiginous. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "There's a woman in town, Martha Ellis, who runs the school. She mentioned last spring that she was looking for someone to help with the younger students on a part-time basis. I've been educated well enough to do it. It would give me income and something useful to do, and a reason to be in town that stands on its own. Harvey looked at her with an expression she was becoming very good at reading, the particular combination of respect and warmth that came over his face when she did something that he found admirable. "That's practical and sensible," he said. "I'm practical and sensible," she said, with the slight dry quality she was learning from him. "You are," he said with complete seriousness. "It's one of the things I most value about you." She held his gaze for a moment. "Harvey," she said, "where is this going?" "Between us?" he asked. "Between us," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, and the quietness was not uncertainty. She had learned to read the different qualities of his silences. It was the quietness of a man choosing the right words for a true thing. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "with whatever that requires in terms of permission and propriety, although I recognize that the conventional sources of permission in your case are presently not available to us." She looked at him. "You want to court me," she said. "I want to court you," he confirmed. "I want to do it honestly and properly and in full view of the town, and not as something hidden or secret, because you have done enough hidden and secret things on my behalf already, and you deserve better than to be a further secret." She felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been held tight for a very long time. "I would like that," she said. "Good," he said. And then carefully, as though the question required some courage even for him, "Do you think in time your father might come around?" "I think in time my father may have no choice but to adapt," she said. "He is not a man who does things because they're right, but he is a man who does things because they work, and eventually the shape of things will make it practical for him to make peace. He has a daughter. He will want to maintain some form of relationship. He is not without feeling for me, only without the capacity to let his feelings override his priorities." "That is a careful and measured view of a complicated man," Harvey said. "I've had 22 years of practice," she said. They began their courtship in the open, which in Painted Rock in 1878 meant walking together on Sunday afternoons, attending the same church and sitting on the same side of the aisle after services, meeting for coffee with Mrs. Greer visible through the parlor window as chaperone, and the whole town visible through the other windows as audience. It was not secret. It was not hidden. It was, Charlotte thought, the most publicly conducted thing she had ever been part of, and she found that she did not mind. There was something relieving about it, something that matched the general sense of clarity and relief she had been living in since the day she had turned her horse around in Harvey's yard and chosen honesty over her father's instruction. Martha Ellis hired her for the school. She started in the first week of September, as the summer heat finally began to break and the mornings came cool and slightly golden, teaching reading and arithmetic to 12 children between the ages of 6 and 9, and found that she was, unexpectedly and completely, very good at it. The children were direct and funny, and in need of the particular kind of patient, attentive energy that she had spent her whole life developing in her father's house, and she brought it to them without resentment and with genuine pleasure. Harvey came to town 4 or 5 days a week, managing the business of his ranch from the Painted Rock end of things as much as was practical, because there were things that needed managing in town, and also because he wanted to be near her, which he said plainly when she asked. Ben Reedy did eventually publish a longer piece about water rights in the valley, still carefully worded, still not naming names directly, but detailed enough that every person in Painted Rock County who could read understood what had happened. There was considerable community discussion. Silas Dalton, to his credit or his pragmatism, did not respond publicly or come after Reedy, which was itself a kind of answer about how much risk he was willing to accept in the current landscape of visible scrutiny. Frank Dalton came to see Charlotte in mid-September, alone, on a Sunday morning, and found her on Mrs. Greer's porch with a cup of coffee and the September issue of a women's magazine that had arrived from the East. He sat in the other chair without asking, which was his way, and was quiet for a moment. "Cal thinks you've lost your mind," he said. "Cal's always thought that," she said. "What do you think?" Frank was quiet again. He had their father's stillness without their father's coldness, which was one of the things that had always made Charlotte love him despite everything. "I think you did what you thought was right," he said. "And I think father pushed you too hard in a direction you weren't willing to go. He asked me to threaten Harvey Collier's livelihood by trading on whatever regard Harvey might have for me," she said. "Yes, that was not something I was willing to do." Frank looked at the street. "Collier," he said, "is it serious?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. Frank absorbed this. "Father won't like it," he said. "I know," she said, "but he doesn't have to like it. He has to eventually accept that it's real." "What does Collier want with the water contract?" Frank asked, and his voice was that of a man genuinely trying to understand rather than argue. "The same thing Marcus Collier always wanted with it," Charlotte said. "Fair water allocation for his land. The ability to run his cattle without having to negotiate his existence every season. It's his. He's keeping it." Frank looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You've gotten harder," he said. "I've gotten clearer," she said. In October, as the valley moved into the first real autumn rains and the creek came back to something like its normal depth, and the cattle put on weight they had been losing all summer, Silas Dalton did something that Charlotte had not entirely expected. He came to town. He came on a Tuesday, riding alone, which was itself unusual enough that it had the quality of a deliberate statement. He left his horse at the livery and walked to the school at the end of the children's morning session, arriving when the last of the students had gone, when Charlotte was erasing the day's arithmetic from the chalkboard. She saw him in the doorway and felt the complicated weight of a whole life compressed into a single moment. "Charlotte," he said. "Father," she said. He came in. He looked around the schoolroom with an expression she could not quite read, a mix of things she had never seen on his face in exactly this combination. "You're teaching school," he said. "Yes," she said. "Paying your own way," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "Collier," he said finally. "He treats you well," she turned to face him directly. "He treats me better than anyone has treated me in a long time," she said honestly. "He is a good man, father. He is honest and steady and fair, and the only reason he was ever your enemy is because you made him one." Her father's jaw tightened. "He's still got the water contract," he said. "He's keeping the water contract," she said. "That's not going to change. And the way you went about trying to take it from him is not going to be forgotten. But it can be moved past if you're willing to move past it honestly." He looked at her with the complicated, weathered expression of a man who has spent 20 years being the most powerful person in his geography and is encountering the first clear limit to that power. "Your mother would have liked him," he said, very quietly. Charlotte felt the sting of tears and chose not to give them to him. "I think so too," she said. He stood there in the small schoolroom for another moment, and she could see the war in him, the pride and the pragmatism and the grief that he never talked about, and the stubbornness that was his defining quality, and the love for her that he had always expressed through control rather than tenderness. "I won't interfere," he said. "That's what I came to say. I won't interfere with him or with you. I won't make it easy, Charlotte, don't expect that, but I won't interfere." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "That's enough for now." He went. She sat down in one of the children's small chairs and put her face in her hands and breathed carefully for several minutes. When she went to Harvey that evening and told him, he was quiet for a long moment. "He came himself," Harvey said. "He came himself," Charlotte confirmed. Harvey nodded slowly. "That took something from him," he said. "It did," she agreed. "Then I think I can work with that," Harvey said. "Over time. If he's willing to let it develop honestly." "He's a pragmatist," Charlotte said. "If things develop in a way that is stable and real, he'll adapt to them because refusing to is more costly than accepting them." "Then we build something stable and real," Harvey said. He reached across the small table and took her hand carefully, and she looked down at it and then up at him, and the warmth between them was enormous and full, and neither of them felt the need to qualify it. December brought cold and the proper rains at last, and Crow Creek rose to something better than half in the valley breathed, and Harvey's cattle went into the winter in better condition than he had feared in August. Charlotte had found a small room in a house on the east side of Painted Rock, owned by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who was delighted to have a boarder and not at all delighted by Mrs. Greer's prices. And Charlotte had moved her few belongings there in October with a sense of permanence that was new and quietly satisfying. Harvey asked her to marry him on the 14th of December, a Sunday, after church, in the cold pale morning light outside the church steps with half the town visible at various distances but not close enough to hear. He had the plain, direct quality about it that was characteristic of him. He said he loved her. He said he had loved her for 2 years and had been careful about it for wrong reasons and was not willing to be careful about it anymore. He said he wanted her at his ranch and at his table and by his side for the rest of his life, and that he understood if she needed time to decide and would wait as long as she needed. She told him she did not need time. She had been deciding, she told him, since the day she had stood in his yard and could not make her feet move toward his porch steps. They were married in February of 1879 in the Painted Rock Church, with Abe Torres standing up as Harvey's best man and Martha Ellis standing with Charlotte, and Mrs. Greer in the front pew with the particular satisfied expression of a woman who considers herself a contributing factor in how things had turned out. Frank Dalton came. Cal Dalton did not, but Cal's absence was its own familiar answer to a question nobody had asked loudly. Silas Dalton sat in the back of the church with the complicated expression of a man who had come, because not coming would have been a greater statement than he was willing to make, and who was working on a rearrangement of his world that was going slowly but was happening. The reception was held in the church hall, with food brought by half the valley and music played by a fiddler from the mercantile's back room, and Charlotte danced with her husband in the small cleared space among the tables, and thought that this was the most honest she had ever been in her life, standing in a room full of people who knew exactly what she was choosing and choosing it in full view. Harvey held her with the careful, particular attention he brought to all things that mattered, and he said into her hair as they turned in the slow pattern of the dance, "You are the bravest person I know." "I'm a person who turned her horse around in a yard," she said. "Yes," he said. And everything came from that. She thought about it, standing in his arms with the fiddle music and the voices of their neighbors around them, about the 6-mile ride with the warning balanced like a coin, about the moment when the coin had fallen, about all the careful things and the one true thing and how the one true thing had cracked the careful shell of her life open and let the real version of it begin. She raised her head and looked at him. "I'm glad I didn't deliver it," she said. "So am I," he said. They went out to the Collier ranch that same evening, Harvey's ranch now theirs, and she walked through the house that had been his uncle's, and then his and now was theirs together with the particular thoroughness of a woman learning the geography of her life. The house needed work. It was a good house, solid and well set on its land, but it had been a bachelor household for nearly 3 years, and it showed in the particular way that bachelor households show things, not dirty but sparse, not uncared for but unloved. She walked through its 4 rooms, and the covered porch, and the kitchen with its good iron stove, and felt the pleasant weight of all the ways she would make it different. Harvey stood in the kitchen doorway watching her take inventory. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Time," she said, "and a few things from the mercantile, and maybe a decent curtain in this window here." "All achievable," he said. She smiled at him. In the spring of 1879, Charlotte found that she was expecting a child. She told Harvey on a Thursday morning in April, standing in the kitchen with the pale spring light coming through the new curtains, and he went very still for a moment in the particular way he had when something large was happening that he needed to absorb before he could speak. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with something in his eyes that she had not seen before, something past happiness, something more fundamental than happiness. "A child," he said. "In November, I think," she said. He pulled her close and held her with a care that was different from all the previous cares, and she stood in it and felt the particular completeness of a person whose life has become exactly what it should be. She continued teaching until late summer, when Martha Ellis found another helper to take the youngest students, and Charlotte came home to the ranch to wait out the last weeks in the slow, golden warmth of September and October. In late October, she went to see her father. It was the third time she had been to the Double D since February, each visit slightly less armored than the last, each one moving incrementally towards something that was not quite what they had been before but was perhaps better, in the way that things that survive a breaking and a remaking can be stronger at the breaks. Silas Dalton looked at his daughter, visibly expecting a child, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "Collier treating you right?" "Harvey treats me very well," she said. "I've told you." Her father nodded slowly. "Come to dinner Sunday," he said, "both of you." "Frank'll be here." She looked at him. "Both of us," she confirmed. "Both of you," he said. She went back to the ranch and told Harvey, and Harvey's response was the steady, pragmatic willingness she expected from him. "Sunday dinner," he said. "Sunday dinner," she confirmed. He asked, he said, "Both of us." Harvey nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll go." The Sunday dinner at the Double D was not easy, but it was real. Silas was stiff and careful, and Frank was friendly in a way that did not require effort, and Charlotte sat at the table of her childhood and ate her father's cook's roast beef and felt the strange, specific tenderness of things that were healing slowly and unevenly, but healing nonetheless. Harvey, because he was Harvey, made it easier by being exactly himself. He did not perform. He did not try to charm or placate. He spoke plainly about the ranch and the water and the winter preparations, and asked Silas a direct question about the Double D's grazing rotation that Silas answered with something very close to respect. Because Silas Dalton, for all his flaws, valued competence, and Harvey Collier was competent in every dimension that Silas understood. They rode home in the last November light, and Charlotte leaned slightly against Harvey's shoulder on the wagon bench, and he put his arm around her carefully. "That was not terrible," she said. "It was actually rather decent," he said. "He's trying," she said, "in his way." "I know," Harvey said. "His way is difficult, but it's what he has. I can work with difficult." "I know you can," she said. The baby was born in November, a boy, healthy and loud and opinionated from the very first hour, with Harvey's dark coloring and Charlotte's eyes. They named him Marcus James Collier, for Harvey's uncle who had started it all, and for James Waverly, the sheriff, who had been a steadfast, honest presence through everything. Harvey held his son in the lamplight of their bedroom, with Charlotte tired and warm in the bed behind him, and the particular wonder of it was something Charlotte watched from the pillow and thought she would never stop being grateful for. Silas Dalton came to see the baby 12 days after his birth. He arrived without announcement, which was his way, and Charlotte met him on the porch and brought him inside and put Marcus James in his grandfather's arms with the particular deliberate generosity of a woman who understood that repair required gestures as well as words. Silas Dalton held his grandson with the stiff unfamiliarity of a man not accustomed to holding things carefully, and then the stiffness eased, and he looked down at the boy, and Charlotte saw on her father's face something that had never been there before, or perhaps had been there and she had not had the angle to see it. Something soft, something genuine, something that did not calculate. Harvey stood in the doorway of the sitting room, watching, and when Charlotte met his eyes he gave her the small nod that meant everything was as it should be. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was harder than the previous year, with cold that came early and stayed, and Crow Creek froze solid for the first time in a decade, which was an inconvenience for everyone but also something beautiful in its way. The whole length of it turned to gray-green ice in the morning light. Harvey's cattle were sheltered in the barn he had expanded in October, and they came through with fewer losses than his neighbors because the preparations had been thorough. And this was noted in the valley in the particular way that competence and foresight are noted in communities where both matter. Ben Reedy did eventually write the full story about the water rights dispute of 1878, waiting until sufficient distance had accumulated to do it with the even-handedness that good reporting required. He was careful with names and careful with facts and careful about what he attributed and to whom, but the shape of it was clear to anyone who read it and knew the valley. Charlotte read it on a Saturday morning in the spring of 1880, sitting at the kitchen table with Marcus James sleeping in the cradle Harvey had built over the winter, and felt the strange experience of seeing her own story told back to her in print. She had turned her horse around in a yard. She had told a man the truth. She had sat across a table and said the difficult thing clearly. These were, in Reedy's telling, acts of courage, and she supposed they were, though they had not felt like courage at the time and more like the last available option when all the careful ones had run out. Harvey read it over her shoulder, and when he finished he pressed a kiss to the top of her head without comment, which was his way of saying the thing that did not need words. In the summer of 1880, Charlotte went back to teaching for the fall term, bringing Marcus James to the school with her each morning in a small basket that Mrs. Ellis accepted with the resigned benevolence of a woman who had organized her classroom around many unusual variables over the years. The baby was a remarkably sociable infant who regarded the schoolchildren with an attentive interest that the children returned enthusiastically, and Charlotte managed the doubled responsibility with the competence she brought to most things, though by October she was tired in a way that had its own meaning. She was expecting again. This time she told Harvey in the evening, in the sitting room after Marcus James had been put to bed, and Harvey set down the ledger he was working through and looked at her with the same quality of stillness he had brought to the first news, absorbing it before speaking. Then he smiled. It was not his careful small smile, the one he used in public and in polite company. It was the full one, the one she had been seeing for long enough now that it still made something warm and certain move in her chest. When he asked, "March," she said. "Good," he said, as though it were simply that, as though the world arriving with new things was simply good. It was a girl. They named her Elizabeth Ann, for Charlotte's mother and for Harvey's sister in Kansas, who had written twice a year since the wedding, and who planned to come and visit as soon as the railroad made the journey practical. Elizabeth Ann arrived in March of 1881 with her mother's stubborn clarity, and her father's dark hair and her brother's talent for being loudly opinionated about conditions she considered unacceptable. Marcus James, at 14 months, regarded his sister with the fascinated wariness of a child who suspects he has been replaced by a superior model. Charlotte watched her children in the warm kitchen of her house on a May morning in 1881, and thought about the August afternoon 3 years ago when she had stood in a yard with a warning she could not deliver, and the whole shape of her life had pivoted on a single moment of honesty. She thought about her father, who came to Sunday dinner now with a regularity that had the quality of a new habit, who held his grandchildren with an increasing ease that had nothing of performance in it. He had not apologized for 1878, not directly, not in the language of explicit acknowledgement, but he had come to Harvey's ranch in the autumn and offered his crew to help with the late harvest work, and Harvey had accepted, and the two men had worked side by side in the field through 3 days of October labor, and something had been established in that working that did not require words to be real. Cal Dalton was still distant. This was a grief Charlotte carried at a quiet level, the brother she had known less well and lost more completely, who had chosen their father's original certainties and could not find a way back from that choice without losing something of himself. She did not stop the door being open. She simply did not force it. Frank Dalton had become, gradually and without ceremony, a genuine friend to Harvey, which Charlotte thought was one of the more unlikely and pleasing developments of the 3 years since everything had changed. They had the ease of men who respected each other's competence and did not need to like everything about each other to get along well. Jim Waverly came to their ranch on a Sunday in June of 1881, as he did occasionally, with the relaxed manner of a man coming to visit rather than conduct official business. And he sat on the porch with Harvey and Charlotte through the warm afternoon and watched Marcus James navigate the yard with the experimental determination of a toddler who has recently discovered that speed is possible, but steering remains aspirational. "Valley's a different place than it was 3 years ago," Waverly said, with the quiet observation of a man noting something true. "Better?" Harvey asked. "More honest," Waverly said, "which I find is generally the same thing." Charlotte, who was nursing Elizabeth Ann in the particular combination of warmth and tiredness and contentment that she had come to identify as one of the most complex emotional states available to a human being, looked at the valley spread out below the porch, the creek showing well this summer, the grass green gold in the late afternoon, the mountains hazy blue at the edge of everything. She thought about secrets and their costs, about the particular kind of courage that is not heroism but just honesty, just the refusal to carry a weight that was not yours, just the turning of a horse in a yard, about how much had grown from that one turn. She looked at Harvey beside her, easy in his chair, watching his son with the attentive warmth that was so characteristic of him, the man who had asked her a simple question on a summer afternoon and had not looked away from the complicated answer. "Harvey," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I'm glad you asked," she said. He did not need to ask what she meant. He had learned her references over 3 years of the particular intimacy of shared history. "So am I," he said. Marcus James, in the yard, attempted to change direction at speed and achieved instead a soft landing in the summer grass, and sat up with the philosophical expression of a child who is considering whether this constitutes an emergency. It did not. He stood and continued his expedition, slightly more thoughtfully. Waverly chuckled. Charlotte pressed her chin to the top of Elizabeth Ann's head and felt the complete, enormous, quiet satisfaction of her life. The summer of 1881 was the best summer the valley had seen in 5 years. The rains came exactly when they should have. The creek ran full and clear and silver cold. Harvey's cattle were fat and healthy going into August, and the ranches all around the valley breathed the particular collective relief of people who have survived a difficult stretch and come out the other side of it. The water contract sat in Harvey's files, in the same place it had always been, and no one came to discuss buying it. Silas Dalton had redirected his considerable energies toward a new irrigation project on the Double D's southern pasture, an ambitious engineering undertaking that was, Charlotte thought, exactly the kind of large and constructive project her father needed. He had come to Harvey 2 months earlier, with the directness of a man who had made a private decision and was acting on it, and asked for information about the creek's seasonal flow patterns that the water contract data would have. Harvey had given it without drama or scorekeeping, and Silas had taken the information and nodded once in the way that was, for him, a kind of thanks. The irrigation project was moving. The Double D was expanding in new directions. The rivalry, which had been the shape of the valley's anxiety for 3 years, had become something more like an ordinary competition between neighboring operations, present but not poisonous. On a Saturday evening in August, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table writing a letter to Harvey's sister in Kansas, who had written with the news that the railroad had finally made the journey from Wichita to the territory not only possible but reasonable, and who was proposing a visit in October. Harvey came in from the evening barn check and set his hat on its hook and poured water from the pitcher and stood at the window looking out at the ranch in the last of the daylight. "Good evening," Charlotte asked without looking up from the letter. "Good evening," he said. "Abe thinks the south pasture fence will hold through winter without replacement if we reinforce 2 sections. "That's good news," she said. "Yes," he said. He came to stand behind her, looked over her shoulder at the letter. "Are we ready for a visitor in October?" he asked. "We have a second bedroom now," Charlotte said. "We are definitively ready." He rested his hands on her shoulders with the easy warmth of a man who had grown completely comfortable with the proximity of the person he loved most, and she leaned back slightly against him without stopping her writing. "Charlotte," he said. "Harvey," she said. "3 years ago you rode into my yard with something you couldn't say," he said. "I remember," she said. "I'm glad you couldn't say it," he said. She set down her pen. She put her hands over his. "So am I," she said. "Every single day." The valley went to sleep in the blue-gold August dark, and Crow Creek ran full and faithful in its banks, and the stars came out over the Collier ranch in their uncountable thousands, and the house was warm with the lives it held. Charlotte finished her letter. Harvey made coffee. Marcus James called out once from his room, and Charlotte went to him, and found him tangled in his blanket, and set him right and tucked it around him. And he went back to sleep with the absolute ease of a child who has never had reason to doubt the safety of the world he woke in. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, watching his small chest rise and fall. She thought, "This is what happens when you turn your horse around. This is what happens when you can't deliver the warning. This is what happens when someone asks you why." She went back to the kitchen where Harvey was at the table with his coffee and his ledger, easy and familiar and exactly himself. And she sat down across from him and picked up her own cup, and the warm light lay across the table between them. And outside, the valley was quiet and the creek ran on, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to grow was growing, and there was nothing hidden, nothing secret, nothing waiting in the dark to come for them. Only this. Only the light. Only the life they had built from one honest moment on a hot August afternoon when a girl who was trying to be brave couldn't make her feet move toward a porch, and a man who valued honesty above nearly everything had asked her the exact right question. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked up. She smiled. He smiled back. And the night settled gently over Painted Rock Valley, over the creek and the cattle and the good green grass, over the Double D and the school and the sheriff's office and the courier's printing press, over everything that had been damaged and repaired and made more honest by the making, over the whole of a world that had been changed by nothing more or less than a woman who chose the truth when the lie would have been far easier, and a man who saw her do it and loved her for it without reservation or qualification. And the two of them building something real and lasting in the particular unflashy way that real and lasting things are built, one steady day at a time.